Hello, class. This is Tom Simmons coming to you with another installment of Economics with Tully. And this is going to be a brief video that is going to address the concept of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. I am making the assumption that you've seen my previous videos that deal with basic supply and demand for a single product, and you understand how supply and demand curves work and shift, and how we model them in a schematic model using quantity on the x-axis and price on the vertical axis. And I'm also operating under the assumption that you've seen my previous videos on how we measure the economy using GDP for production and the unemployment rate and the consumer price index for price stability. So this video is the link between all those macro measurements and then where we go next. And where we go next is if we have some type of macro failure, high unemployment, price instability, production is falling, a recession, is there a role for government? Is there something that should be done in order to correct the macro failure? And the link between the measurements and the policy tools are these models that we call the aggregate demand and aggregate supply models. And there's essentially two basic ways that we attempt to model macro failure so that we can look at ways to correct it. The first of these models is a very, very simplified mathematical model that says that C, the letter C, plus G, plus I, plus XN equals GDP. Very often in older textbooks, GDP is replaced with the letter Y. So C plus I plus G plus XN equals Y, or GDP. So let's go through each of those terms. C is the largest element of looking at what goes into GDP, and it stands for consumer expenditures. The kinds of things that you spend money on every day, from gasoline to food to movie tickets to a haircut to clothing. That's consumer expenditures, what the people are spending their money on. And it's always the largest part of that GDP equation. The I refers to business investment in new equipment and in capitalizing so that they can make new exciting things for you to be able to purchase. The G refers to government expenditures, because obviously government spends a lot of money. Government buys asphalt and steel and concrete in order to repair or build a bridge or a roadway, and they pay salaries to government workers, to teachers, to road crews who work for them, DPW crews. So government has always been a very large element of that whole equation as well. And then the last part of that equation, XN, stands for net exports. And what that means is a certain amount of money leaves the country as we purchase things from other nations, such as about 98% of the clothing on your back, which is now made in foreign nations. That's money that's leaving our economy because we're sending it elsewhere. But that is also offset by the purchases that other nations are making from us. And other nations do purchase a lot of goods from us. A lot of the food that we produce is shipped around the world. A lot of our pharmaceuticals, our biotech, our technology, computer software, things like that. So there is a back and forth with international trade, and I have an entire series of videos on that as well. But if you take those four elements, consumer expenditures, business investment, government expenditures, and net exports, what's coming in less what's going out in terms of cash, that gives us one model of what our GDP, our gross domestic product, ought to be. Now, outside of being overly simplistic, one of the criticisms of this is that by using a model that's as simple as that, we tend to make the mistake of thinking that it's simply an issue of math. For instance, if each of those four elements was given the value of 2, 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 equals 8. Well, if one of those values should fall from 2 to 1, let's say consumer expenditures fell from $2 to $1, it's very easy to make the assumption that all one must do is increase one of the other elements by 1, and you come out in the same place. So that maybe you wouldn't have 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 equals 8. Maybe you'd have 1 plus 3 plus 2 plus 2 equals 8. Same thing, right? Well, a lot of economists would say, some economists would say yes, and that's why you need government to pick up the slack when people stop spending. Other economists would say no, that government expenditures do not act the same way in an economy that consumer expenditures do. And here's why. When consumers hold back on spending, they're afraid that hard times are coming up, they're worried about their jobs, they're afraid their income may go down, they stop spending across a wide range of categories that they probably feel they don't need they really don't need to purchase right now in their lives. Maybe it's vacation, maybe it's restaurant meals, maybe it's luxury items that they really don't need. But each individual makes that decision, and then overall, of course, when we all hold back from purchases, there's an effect on the economy. Now, if government sees that and says, well, let's get some spending going, yes, they can make up the lost spending, but chances are they're not going to make those expenditures in the same categories that you or I would. They're not going to make up the spending by spending money on restaurant meals. They may instead say, well, let's use X number of million or billion dollars to help a particular auto company, to use a real example. Well, the problem with that is that consumers long ago made the choice to stop spending their dollars with that particular company. Now government is using their money, which is of course your and my tax money, to support those very industries or segments or firms that consumers have chosen not to patronize. And so what happens is when spending is transferred from consumers to government, it provides false signals to the market. By government all of a sudden rushing in and spending money with certain industries and certain firms and certain sectors, they're giving the impression that consumers actually have a desire for those particular products, when in fact the consumer may not have a desire for those products whatsoever. And what happens is the sector or the firm that is benefited by the government spending then hires people and starts producing goods, but no one really wants to buy those goods. And in the long term, they've now hired people and produced goods that no one wants, and they actually could be in a worse position than before because they've spent money and they've got no additional money coming in, and they've hired people that they can't pay, and we go into a downward spiral again. So yes, it's easy to look at a very simple formula that our GDP is comprised of consumer and government and business and net export income. But it's not really legit to say that government spending can simply pick up the slack from consumer spending, because we'll spend it on different products and different services. When consumers begin spending again, they're giving signals to the economy that this is what consumers really do in fact wish to purchase. And those industries can then get a little excited about producing more goods and hiring people because they see that people are once again desiring their goods. But when government does it based on who they particularly want to favor in that particular expenditure, in that particular bill, it doesn't necessarily translate into consumer desire for those goods or services. So that's the first model. The second aggregate demand model we look at is not so much a simple math formula as it is a simple graph. Now, those of you who have been with me a while have been through the process of constructing supply and demand graphs, and we always construct those for a single product. Supply and demand for coffee in a particular community. And we add together all the consumers who want to buy coffee, and we take a look at the quantities they wish to purchase at different price levels. And we take all the suppliers, all the people who make coffee, and we add all the quantities together to show how many cups of coffee they'd be willing to supply at every price level. And somewhere in the middle, the forces of supply and the forces of demand meet, and you have a certain number of cups of coffee trading hands in the course of a day, equilibrium quantity, at about around a particular price, and that's the equilibrium price. And that price isn't something dictated by government or anything else. It's simply the result of the clash of these independent forces of supply and demand. So in order to look at the entire macroeconomy, we're now going to do something that at first glance seems a little odd. We're going to take the demand for azalea bushes and add it to the demand for coffee, and add it to the demand for stockings, and add it to the demand for carburetors, and add it to the demand for pizza. And we're going to take the demand for every product of every good that you can think of that is desired in the economy and roll it together into one enormous demand curve. So the demand curve we now have is not for a specific product. It's a demand curve for all goods and services, and that's what we call the aggregate demand curve. And since demand curves for individual products are always negatively sloped, we're adding all them together, the aggregate demand curve will also be negatively sloped. And then we're going to do the same thing for supply. We're going to take the supply curve for oregano and add it to the supply curve for dishwashing detergent, and add it to the supply curve for bread, and add it to the supply curve for air conditioning units, and add it to the supply curve for Purina dog chow. And we're going to end up with this one enormous supply curve that represents what all producers in the nation are willing to supply at different price levels within the economy. And as you probably guessed, we're going to give that a special name, and that's the aggregate supply curve. And just as individual supply curves are positively sloped, so will the aggregate supply curve be positively sloped. And so it looks on a graph, on a schematic graph, it looks exactly the same as a demand and supply curve for any particular product, except now we're representing the entire economy. Demand for everything and supply of everything. So once you do that, you may ask yourself, well, what does that mean? I know that when a demand curve for coffee intersects a supply curve for coffee, that what that means is that a certain quantity will trade hands at a certain price. What does it mean when you've got a demand curve for azalea bushes crossed with a supply curve for dog food? Well, think of it this way. The x-axis, the horizontal axis on a graph, typically represents quantity, the quantity of a particular good. So if we're taking demand for all goods and services, and we're looking at where it meets up with the supply for all goods and services, then the equilibrium is not the quantity of one product, that equilibrium where they meet gives us the quantity of all goods and services trading hands in the economy. And if that sounds a lot like GDP, it should. Because what is GDP except the value of all the goods and services being produced in the economy, as evidenced by what people are actually buying? So now we have a model where we can actually use GDP, one of our measurements, on the horizontal axis. Now, what does the vertical axis normally represent? For a single product, it's the price of that good. It tells us what the equilibrium price would be. So what happens when we take a demand curve for lipstick and cross it with a supply curve for coffee? Where those two curves meet, the demand for everything and the supply for everything, it gives us an equilibrium price level, the general level of all prices in the economy. Sounds a lot like CPI, doesn't it? The Consumer Price Index. So now the vertical axis, instead of being a price for a product, is the general level of prices of all goods in the economy. So now we have two of our three major measurements on different axes of a typical supply and demand graph. The only one that's missing, since we've plotted production, GDP, and price stability, CPI, the one that's missing is employment or unemployment. And years ago, an economist named Arthur Okun did a study of the relationship between employment in a society and the GDP of a society. And what he found was that they move together. If GDP increases, you can bet that employment, not unemployment, but employment has also increased proportionately. If GDP decreases, then employment decreases proportionately. In other words, they move together. There's a causal relationship, not just a correlation, between these two factors, employment and GDP. Now we have all three of our major measurements on a single graph. So, do a schematic supply and demand graph. Your x-axis represents both employment and GDP. Your vertical axis represents price levels. Now, if we were looking at a single product, let's say, again, supply and demand for coffee, if it was very cold out and maybe, I don't know, a doctor's report comes out or Oprah reports that coffee is actually really good for you, it makes you really healthy, we know that demand for that particular product would shift to the right. Demand would increase. And that would increase the equilibrium quantity on the x-axis, and it would also increase, we'll put an upward pressure on the price level, on the y-axis. So now, instead of talking about one product, we're talking about all products. We're modeling the entire macroeconomy. So now, instead of people saying, hey, yeah, let's go out and buy more coffee, maybe let's envision a situation where consumers are more confident. They believe that good times are ahead. They are confident about their job. They're not worried. They have a little extra money coming in maybe. They got a raise. Good times. Well, all of those things, an increase in income and consumer expectations, are normally determinants of demand, which would shift demand to the right or increase it. So if aggregate demand, the demand for all goods and services, increases, what does that do to our equilibrium? Well, it increases the equilibrium quantity, which in this case is employment and GDP, which makes sense. If people want to go out and buy things, they feel confident again, that's going to mean they're going to run out, they're going to spend money in stores. Those stores are going to have a reason to hire more people, you're going to see an increase in employment, and as people buy more, that's an increase in GDP. But what also happens? There's also, when you shift demand to the right, there's also an increase or upward pressure on equilibrium price, which means we may begin to see a little inflation creep into an economy. As people spend more and more people are hired, it's going to put an upward pressure on prices. The opposite is also true. Right after the terrorist attacks on New York City, there was serious concern that people would be scared, that they wouldn't spend their money as freely, that they'd be worried about times ahead, and that they would shrink or pull back on their expenditures. Well, that would be an aggregate demand shift to the left. When that happens, the equilibrium quantity, GDP, and employment would decrease. We would begin to see ourselves move into a recession as people purchase less and as people begin to get laid off as a result of that. What else would happen? Price levels would decrease, not increase, but decrease. This is exactly what we saw in the Great Depression. GDP decreased and employment decreased, x-axis. Price levels came way down on the y-axis. Businesses could no longer sell things at a price that enabled them to cover the cost of production, which means they ended up laying off people. And you can see how this becomes a downward spiral, because people who are laid off don't have money to buy things, which further means less buying, less GDP, lower prices. Same thing happened in the financial collapse, the Great Recession as we're now calling it, in 2008. Prices did not get really high. You may have felt the squeeze because you had less money coming in if you got laid off or someone in your family got laid off, and you had less disposable income. But prices did not go through the roof. In fact, prices of many goods and services actually fell or stayed the same at the same time that employment fell and GDP fell. In times of recession, all three of those measurements, GDP, employment, and prices, will fall. In good times, all three of those will increase in the normal case. And there's going to be, there's at least one case we can talk about in the 1970s where it didn't happen that way. And if you want to watch my video on supply side economics, you'll have an explanation as to what happened there. So we now have the model that we can use, same old supply and demand model, to measure the macroeconomy and to test things, to see if government does this, or if we do this, or if people do this, what effect is it going to have on price levels? What effect is it going to have on employment and GDP? So two models, the mathematical model, which derives from something called the circular flow. That's the 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 model equals 8, no matter who's, and even if one falls, you can just bump the other one up, and the schematic supply and demand model. So that was a very brief overview of these models, and it's a way to bridge us, as I said earlier, from how do we measure the macroeconomy. Well, now here's a way to actually put it to paper, so that we can see where do we need to go, what do we need to do to fix it. Okay, that's it. Good speaking with you again, and we'll see you next time.